Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Business as Usual podcast. This is our October 2020 episode. We're changing the format a little bit. Mike's going to talk a little bit more about that. Before we do, check out last month's podcast, which was an interview with Ian Marcuse, who writes the textbooks, who has worked for the exam board, put together a lot of the courses that you'll be studying. He gives some expert tips on student success. Well worth a listen, especially at the start of a new academic year, if you're looking to sort of up your business game over the next 12 months. Also, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. You can find us on both at BusinessAUPod.
So in this podcast, Jack's right, we're going to change the structure for this season 2 of the Business as Usual podcast. So we are going to do monthly instead of weekly, but we're gonna pack a lot more quality content into each podcast. So we're going to start off each month with the last month's news headlines, the key ones, 3 or 4 headlines. We're going to try and link them to as much of the spec as we can, especially the topics that you will be learning in class now or teaching in class now. So today, our first topic is going to be organic versus inorganic growth. So that's a topic kind of based approach that we're going to look at, usually picking topics that are slightly tricky. Then we're going to go on to look at a common student misconception. We're going to look at one a month. So today we're going to look at going from a sole trader to a limited company, or just selling more shares in your limited company, and what most students are assuming wrong. And then finally, we are writing a case study, an original case study that is going to come with a question for each year group. So year 10, 11, 12 and 13. We would like you as students to send in your responses, and teachers that are listening, send in maybe some of your best students' responses. We'll have a scout through those. We'll pick 1 or 2 out that particularly catch our eye, and we will show them and discuss them on the next podcast. We really hope you enjoy the new content.
Yeah, so we decided to switch it up a little bit. We're also going to make sure that there's some resources to go with it. So you'll be able to collect the resources from our website, which we'll put on the last slide, and we'll share when we put this on YouTube and Twitter and Spotify, etc. Where you'll be able to download sort of a sheet to fill in as a little bit of a recap, so that you can basically use it as something that we wanted to be something a little bit more interactive. I think with the podcast in the background, some of the feedback we got was that students preferred them when they had sort of moving slides, so they were able to see it on the screen as well as and watch it, as well as being able to then potentially just put it on in your headphones on your walk home from school, or on your walk to the gym, or when you're working out or whatever. So we're trying to offer a little bit more, and hopefully we'll find that students find it a little bit easier to engage with, and something that is a little bit more tangible at the end of the process. So starting off, we're going to look at a few news stories, and the first one that really caught my eye, I saw on Twitter the other day. Usually we try and get our news stories. Last year we got our news stories from reputable news sources. Twitter isn't really one, but this one really did catch my eye. I thought it was a really creative way of marketing, a really creative sponsorship tie-up between Stevenage Borough FC. They might have actually dropped Stevenage Borough. I think they're just Stevenage FC now, and Burger King. And I think the key thing here is that unless you're near Stevenage, you probably haven't heard of Stevenage. But this was a really creative way for Burger King to get some recognition. What they basically did was they sponsored Stevenage in real life, even though Stevenage were at the time the very worst team in the Football League, and I think 92 out of 92. And the primary purpose of this was they knew that if they had Burger King written on the shirts of Stevenage FC, then their logo would appear on the shirts on FIFA, which is obviously a hugely successful video game that I imagine every one of our students will have heard of, and most of them probably play when they're supposed to be doing homework. And so they did a few things. They had this big push where they were trying to get people to sign the very best players in the world on the career mode, and it worked hugely. So the shirts sold out for Stevenage Borough because it became so popular. People wanted to have these Stevenage Borough shirts with Burger King on the front, and Stevenage were the most played team on career mode on FIFA last year, which is quite astonishing considering that they're such a small club right at the bottom of the totem pole.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they made the Stevenage challenge, didn't they? The season challenge. So you had to try and get as far as you could with Stevenage, which was a tough prospect. Use your FIFA skills, then post in updates on atting them on Twitter, And yeah, if they were impressed enough, they were giving away free burgers left, right, and centre. So yeah, I mean, it got great attention all over social media. And if you played career mode, it would be silly not to, wouldn't it? Essentially, really clever marketing for
Not
Burger King.
great for the healthy lifestyle, is it? To combine sitting at home playing computer games instead of doing something more active and like real sport, for example. And then not only that, but giving away free fast food to people who are doing it. It doesn't really, it maybe doesn't send the most positive message about an active lifestyle and healthy eating, but it is a very good, effective example of a promotional method. So that does have a big link to the curriculum and obviously branding as well, and that the sort of recognizable Burger King brand, which
Yeah,
I
I mean, it's
think it's fair to
interesting.
say is more recognizable than Stevenage's brand.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the Stevenage brand, because I know Stevenage. It's not too far from me. I used to work up that way. They do a lot of stuff in the local community to try and make kids more active. They go to all the schools and give training sessions, etc. So I am slightly surprised that they took the Burger King sponsorship, because it is at odds with their brand, which is all about community, helping community, and especially health. So it must have
Money,
been a nice
money talks, doesn't
sponsorship
it?
fee
Yeah.
from Burger King.
What's next on the news stories then?
So the next one, so obviously we've talked about the high street a lot in season one of the Business as Usual podcast, but this is quite an interesting one. So New Look, along with many other high street stores, have been struggling with coronavirus. The high street has died even more than it had before. People are buying online during lockdown a lot more, understandably. And they've really struggled. You've seen a lot of stores closing down, a lot of high streets empty. So a lot of the stores have been proactive, and they've tried to get rent cuts, payment holidays, so they don't have to pay their rent for maybe 6 months. New Look have been the first one that have really come through and got a good agreement. So they've managed to agree with their landlords that they will have a rent holiday on most of their stores, and for the remainder of the stores, they will pay rent based on how on their sales volume. So if they are busy, they will pay more rent. If they're quiet, they will pay less rent. So it's quite an interesting one. Could
That's really
coronavirus
interesting.
be
Yeah.
the last nail in the coffin of the high street or not? That's the question.
No, I know there's a number of businesses really struggled, especially those who didn't have a very prominent or successful e-commerce setup. And you look at a business like Primark, for example, for months while we were under lockdown and the retail stores were closed, Primark were getting absolutely nothing because they don't have an online store. They've done pretty well since. From what I gather, there's been like queues outside Primark, but there's a lot of those businesses who are a little bit in between, and they have a huge amount of money tied up in these physical stores, and they can't afford to lose them. And so it's interesting to see that that's quite a creative response to the problem, isn't it? The New Look the option that New Look have taken, but it allows them to sort of effectively budget and sort of figure out their profit, because they know that it's their costs are going to be proportionate to their income, which hopefully will avoid them being in a situation where perhaps on a quiet month they don't receive enough cash inflow to cover their costs, which I think that's really quite a creative way of getting around that problem.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if this is something that other landlords will allow. Could this be the new normal, as we've heard a million times? Could it be that rent will be a variable cost when we do the next spec of GCSE and A level?
Yeah.
Be interesting to go forward 5 years and see if that's the case.
Because the landlords, typically in the past, they would have had quite a lot of power, especially if you've got a good high street spot. Because if one business, if you wanted to increase your prices and the existing tenant didn't want to pay it, you had a range of suitors who would want that high street spot. But that's definitely not the case at the moment. Those landlords don't have very much power at all, because what's the alternative if they can't have New Look or other sort of high street stores in their premises? Those premises are likely to sit empty.
Yep.
The
Yeah,
next
definitely.
story the next story that we're gonna have a look at is on the new Xbox. Really, really interesting for anyone who's even remotely interested in computer games. I actually, until we looked at this one, I didn't actually know quite what they were doing. If I'm gonna be completely honest with you guys, I'm a bit of a PlayStation guy. PlayStation's been a constant in my life since I was a young child. And the new PS5's coming out before Christmas, right in time for Christmas, and I think it's coming out pretty much at the exact same time, the exact same week as the new Xbox.
About
But the
mid-November,
Xbox,
I think.
yeah, I think it is November, yeah. But the Xbox has done something quite innovative with their pricing strategy, and it's a huge change. It's something that we've never seen in a games console before. They're effectively gonna launch it on there's an option to buy it upfront, as there normally would be, for I think the prices range between, what is it, £350 and £450 or something like that.
I think the cheaper one's more on the
250,
260
yeah.
odd. Yeah. But
The
yeah, the
smaller white one
expensive
that
one
you can see on
350
the
odd.
screen. But the one big difference is you can now get it as a subscription. Now, subscriptions have grown in popularity over the last few years, with people having subscriptions for their mobile phones, subscription for their TV services like Netflix and Disney Plus, etc., subscriptions for their car in terms of monthly payments. And so they've effectively said that the two different variants, the expensive Xbox, the high sort of level Xbox, which I think is the Series X, is going to be available for $28.99 a month for 2 years, and then after the 2 years, you own the console. Very similar to a phone contract would be. And then the smaller version, the Xbox S, is £20.99 a month, and it doesn't, over the course of the 2 years, it doesn't actually provide a huge saving. It's a saving of about £20 on the bigger version and about £10 on the smaller version. But what it really does do, which I think is really interesting, is it allows them to effectively take away that barrier to entry of people not having £450, especially with the coronavirus and with sort of incomes being stretched as they are at the moment. It makes it much easier for people to just to get an Xbox, where they only have to pay a £30 upfront cost and then manage it over a monthly period of time, rather than one big upfront cost that they potentially have to save for or dip into savings for.
Yeah, I mean, it is a big barrier, and it will be more of a barrier now than it ever has been. I mean, that it's well known they lose money on each console they sell, isn't it? I mean, that's another interesting point. So they're going to take an even bigger hit up front with the monthly payments rather than the upfront payment for the console. So you could argue it's risky, but it's an interesting move. They've essentially accepted that they're an inferior product to Sony's PlayStation, and they've gone for the value proposition. Because what you get with it is pretty amazing as well. And I'm a PlayStation guy, so I'm I'm biased towards the PlayStation, if anything. But yeah, the Xbox offer of free games that are AAA to after a month maybe, or even on launch. As you can see down the bottom, they've bought Bethesda, which make huge games, including Doom, Fallout, etc., Skyrim. So you're going to be able to get all of them thrown in with your £20.99 or £28.99 a month, and you don't necessarily have to buy any games other than FIFA, of course, because that won't be thrown in. But yeah, it's really interesting, and it grabbed my attention even as a diehard PlayStation guy. So they must be at least on the right track from getting a good bit of PR anyway.
There'll be a huge sort of segment of the market, especially the younger people, who are trying to, who will be looking ahead to Christmas and what have you, and thinking that they'd like to get the next console, who perhaps their family circumstances or their personal circumstances will mean that they can't afford to spend the £450 on the new PS5, and maybe this is a more appropriate choice for them. So they will definitely get customers because of this strategy. I think it's really, really clever.
Yes, they will definitely get more customers. I mean, just as a slight aside, their new range, their names are very similar to their old range. So I don't know if you saw, but they also saw record numbers of purchases of the old system on Amazon because it's so tightly knitted to their new version. So parents out there are going to have to be careful they buy the new one, not the old one. And if you're getting your parents to buy you one, make sure they know the difference between the Xbox Series X and the Xbox X.
I remember when I was about 14, maybe 14 or 15, my mum, bless her, I asked her to go and get us a copy of Grand Theft Auto, whatever the new Grand Theft Auto was, about 2004. This will probably have been 2003. And obviously, I couldn't go and buy it myself because it's an 18 rated game and I was not 18. And she came back with Hitman 2, I think, or Hitman. And bless her, she had no idea what she was doing.
That was not even close.
No, no. But to be fair, she probably just saw the guns on the front cover and thought, "This is the appropriate game that my son
Yeah,
wants to play."
it's violent. It'll do.
Yeah, and she went back and swapped it. My mum was a legend. She didn't have to do that, but she did. The last story that we're going to have a look at this month
is another takeover. So we just talked about the Bethesda takeover. So we've got another huge takeover. William Hill, all over our high streets, big online presence, a gambling company. They are possibly at the heart of a takeover battle between two firms. So one is Caesars. You might have heard of them. They own a lot of casinos. If you've been to the US, especially in Vegas, they are looking to purchase William Hill. And you've also got an investment company that they make their living just by taking people's pension funds, for example, and investing them in companies for a return. So they've got two companies looking to buy them. Will they remain William Hill? Will they be Caesars William Hill if they win the battle? It'll be an interesting one. But they're an example of a company that have a huge high street presence, but they've really transferred that well to e-commerce. So they've got a thriving e-commerce income. So that's how you stay relevant in this current economy. So yeah, it'll be interesting. Corporate growth for Caesars. It would be a takeover. Caesars are bigger than William Hill. A bit of horizontal integration because they're in similar markets, even though they're coming into the UK market. But will there be synergy? So synergy. So take it from there, Jack.
Yeah, there's a nice little link to Ansop's Matrix there as well from the Caesars perspective when you're thinking about potentially going into a new market. That market development or that diversification, if it's moving away from sort of casinos to a little bit more sort of the standard sports gambling, which obviously William Hill specialise in, horse racing and football and what have you. How are the I haven't read about it, but how are the bookmakers doing over the pandemic? Is there, you can imagine that it's probably going one of two ways really, and there's probably examples of both where people don't bet because they're being more cautious with their money, and equally people who are struggling a little bit might bet in the hope that they're able to claw some potential lost income back. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've read, they've seen a downturn in their greyhound and horse race betting, because you've got the older generation. Yeah, not been taking place, and even if they have been like virtually or whatever, the older people aren't able to go into the stores, are they? Or if they are, it's only like 5 at a time, etc. So they've been staying home, but they've seen a lot more younger people gambling during lockdown from boredom. I think is what the news story was outlining. So they've actually seen overall that their volume through the website and their matched bets has actually gone up.
That's quite interesting.
Which is concerning.
That ends the news section of this month's podcast. We are now going to do a little bit on organic v inorganic growth in 5 minutes. Effectively, the point of this is, we've had we did a few Instagram posts. We did a short topic study. We did one on Ansop's Matrix a while ago, at some point last year. And I think it's really useful to sometimes just have just a snapshot of a particular subject. And maybe it's not something that you're studying right now. Maybe it's something you're going to study later in the year, or maybe it's a little bit of a revision from the previous year. But based on the news stories, we had a little bit of a look at organic and inorganic growth. And so we just wanted to talk a little bit about what the difference is between these and how the theory links to the news stories that we've just seen. So we've got organic growth, which is growing through expansion of our existing operations, and then the potential benefits of that. And there's some examples of that in the news stories. We've obviously got Xbox, a pretty prominent example, who actually demonstrate both inorganic and organic growth in that news story. But their sort of natural progression where they've developed the next stage of their console. I think this is the 4th generation now, isn't it, of the Xbox? We had the original one, the 360, the Xbox One, and now this Xbox Series X. And so that's something that they've built up over the last 20 years. They've grown that. And some of the benefits to potentially doing a more organic growth strategy is it does tend to be quite easy to budget for because the spend is more gradual. You don't have to spend a huge amount of money all up front, whereas a takeover would likely be very expensive. And because it's more gradual, you're less likely to require external finance. The other key benefit, which can't be understated, is if this is something that you've built up from scratch, or this is a big sort of strategy that you've been building for a long period of time, as a leadership team, you're likely to have more influence and control over the direction. You're going to have more control over your staff and the culture in your business. And those things are going to hopefully lead to success. The problem with organic growth is it tends to be slower. Now, if another competitor has already got there first and you maybe can't quite compete with them because of their first mover advantage, there might be you can miss the boat kind of thing with organic growth. Mike, do you want to talk through inorganic?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting the Microsoft should say Xbox one, because they've done both organic and inorganic. So inorganic growth is where you are growing through an acquisition, a takeover, or a merger. So a takeover being where one company's taking over, usually a much smaller company. A merger being two companies of similar size joining forces together, slightly less usual. We've seen it quite a lot in the pharmaceutical companies over the years. But I mean, they have bought Bethesda because they've realized that for their subscription service to work, they need to have a good offering of games. So they've bought a ready-made company in Bethesda that have got good track record. They've got strong sales success, and that will allow them to get good revenue coming in straight away, but also an offering for their free premium service that should get them shifting a fair few Xboxes. In theory, the benefits, it is quicker. It's definitely quicker for them to buy Bethesda with ready-made games rather than try and set up their own studios. And like I say, they've got that reputation, so it should, in theory, reduce risk of success. But the drawback of failure, I should say, but the drawbacks are that they have paid a premium for that. It's cost them a lot more than it would have done to set up their own
7.5
studio.
billion.
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive to design games anyway, as any developer will tell you. But 7.5 billion is a hell of a lot. They've paid a premium for that to get that through quick, and that proves how well Sony are doing with their PlayStation. That's forced them into that kind of move. But then you have the potential for culture clash and a lack of synergy. So it's the opposite of economies of scale, where you could see that the two companies operating together will actually have a lower output than if you took them two individually and added them together. So, I mean, the problem could be that Bethesda are very dynamic, a very, very modern company that have lots of creative minds and are very fixed in their way of how they want to do things. With their games are going to have Microsoft that have come along and bought them, a very old school, if you will, company that are nothing like, say, Google, for example. Much more standard way of working, less flexible working, very, old school culture. You could see some issues there if Microsoft go in there and try and manage them the way they would Microsoft. So it'll be interesting.
You'd think the sensible thing would be if you're taking over or merging with a successful company, the main reason you're going to have to pay that premium is because of their success, and because you're not just paying for what their value is now, but you're paying for the opportunity to benefit from their growth and value over the next 10, 20 years. So you have to pay a little bit over the odds for that. And so if you're going to spend that kind of money, you would think that you'd want to take it over in the way in which it's been successful. So you'd think that you'd want to let them get on with doing what they do best, and just benefiting from it and being able to tie it in. Obviously, Xbox have got this new subscription service where you can subscribe and get access to sort of classic games. Well, this is a really easy way to fill that portfolio in a sense. It's quite similar to where if Netflix bought it's similar to Netflix buying the rights to a particular production company's products, but it's probably a little bit more similar to if Netflix actually just bought a production company.
Oh, we actually talked about that, didn't we? In one of those, not Netflix, but it's essentially like Disney Plus buying Fox, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're obviously buying Lucasfilm at a period of time as well for all the Star Wars. Yeah, that was in the Paper 3 pre-release bit where we talked about the streaming industry and the entertainment industry. Mike, we've got a misconception of the month, and so just to introduce this concept, as teachers, there's always certain mistakes where you see them and you can understand why students make that mistake. But it's the kind of thing that suggests to an examiner that the student doesn't have a very in-depth knowledge. And so what we want to try and do is we've picked out a bunch of these misconceptions, and over the course of the year, we want to go through these misconceptions and just sort of give a little bit more context and just explain something that you might, as a student, you might believe, but obviously are incorrect on. So, Mike, what's our misconception this month?
Yeah, so this first one drives examiners mad. And I can understand, like you say, why students think that, because even some textbooks will phrase it in a way that makes you believe this is true. So if you sell some shares, let's say you're a limited company, if you sell some shares in your business, it means you will lose control of decision making completely, and they can even get rid of you. They could fire you. The amount of times I read that as a teacher, I read it as an examiner, um, more than I've had hot dinners. So there's a problem here, because you don't necessarily lose control. What you do have, and this is what I stress to my students, is you have more pressure placed upon you. Yeah, so you'll make decisions. Yeah, and you're under more scrutiny. Now you have shareholders, because you have stakeholders that have an interest in the decisions you're making. So you might have to have the shareholders in mind when you make a decision. What are they going to think? The only time they can really forcefully put their opinion across as shareholders is once a year in an AGM. So yes, they can put their points across and say they really haven't liked the decisions you've made, and they could even call for a vote to get rid of you as the CEO if it's a big enough company. But that's once a year. It's unlikely. And that's what you want to get across. If you want to get across that if you're a GCSE student, that you're a grade 9 student, or if you're an A-level student, that you are an AA star student, just remember it's pressure that you are going to open yourself up to, not necessarily that you're going to lose control. And that's even if you're giving up, a controlling stake in theory in your firm. It's very unlikely that they're going to oust you as the owner and question every single decision that you make.
Yeah, it depends entirely on the situation, doesn't it? Because there might be a very wealthy individual or a business that takes over another company, and they buy 70% of the shares. They might not want to have the decision-making responsibility. They might just want to have the financial benefit of owning the company. So, if you're an entrepreneur and you've started a company and it's really successful, and you get offered a huge sum of money for it, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you give up more than 50% of the company, you're just not going to be able to make those decisions anymore. It depends on the circumstances. Sometimes, of course, that is the case, but it could well be that they just want to invest in the idea that you've come up with, and they want you to continue to run it the way it's working. So it's one of those things where, the key misconception is don't assume that it always means that they lose control of decision making, but also you should avoid saying that it will do anything, because quite often, in matter of fact, it's so circumstantial, it's so based on context that you can say that it may cause them to lose control, because it might, but don't say that it will. And that's, I guess, the thing that we're trying to sort of just let students know, that that's not necessarily the case.
That's definitely a good thing to keep in mind. Try not to make an assertion and say will. So yeah, that's one way you can get around it, I suppose. But you can show an even greater depth understanding if you could explain why it may not be the case or it may be the case, and you could even then say what you think would be most likely, I suppose, in that paragraph, and then that's a well-rounded, developed paragraph showing you know your stuff.
Good, great. Hopefully that helps some students. The last step in the last part of our monthly podcast, our October podcast, is we've put together some GCSE and A-level exam questions. There's a case study that you can use for both sets, and Mike has quite experienced as an examiner and as someone who writes quite a lot of exam questions. He's written a sample question for Year 10 students, Year 11 students, so for students doing the GCSE, and an example of a question for a Year 12 student and a Year 13 student based on topics that they will have covered or will be covering this month, hopefully. So we'll attach these we'll put these on our website. We'll attach a link to these so you can download them as a sort of form to fill in. And then, as we mentioned at the very top, as Mike said at the top, if you've got any question, if you want to share your answers with us, we'll have a look through and we'll try and pick out the best ones, and we'll share them next time. We'll go through an example of a question for maybe two of them, an example of an answer for maybe two of them, and we'll talk about why it's a good answer and potentially maybe even some areas where it could be improved. So hopefully you'll find that not only have you learned something during this podcast, but also now you've got a little bit of an activity to really sort of prove that you to hopefully make progress throughout the course.
Yeah, definitely. I'll look forward to reading some of those answers. You'll notice that for the Year 10 and 12, you just started your course, they're shorter questions. So you might have only learned how to do a 3 marker and a 4 marker. But for Year 11 and 13, they are much higher tariff questions. But if Year 11 and 13 want to do the 12 and 10 one, of course, send them in. If you just note down if you want your name mentioned and your school mentioned, or if you want to remain anonymous in your submission.
Thank you very much for watching. Please do let us know if there's anything else that you'd like to see on the podcast. We do want to try and make sure that we're catering to what students want. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, if you want to keep up to date with these and sort of see some some more stories as we go through the month. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at BusinessAUPod. To access the resources, so the sort of the recap sheets and the exam question sheets to fill in, you can visit our website, which is www.edifyed.co.uk/business, where you can watch this podcast. It'll be posted on there each month, and you'll be able to download those resources as well. And we will see you next month.
See you then.